Before there was fear, there was training. Picture, if you can, the red clay of Georgia, the piney woods of Fort Benning, where in 1940 the United States Army began an experiment. Paratroopers. Airborne infantry. Men who would willingly leap from perfectly good airplanes into the unknown. The volunteers came from all walks of life. Farm boys who'd never seen an airplane up close. Factory workers from Detroit and Pittsburgh. College students with something to prove. They gathered beneath the southern sun, and they learned to fall. At first, the training was almost comically simple. Wooden platforms. Rope swings. Barrels to roll across fields, teaching them to absorb impact. Then came the towers, 34 feet high at first, then taller, until finally, the 250-foot structures loomed like steel giants against the Georgia sky. The men would hook their harnesses, step into nothing, and drop, feeling the jolt, the swing, the sudden catch of silk and air. But it wasn't just about falling. The training was relentless, methodical, designed to forge something beyond ordinary soldiers. 5-mile runs before breakfast. Forced marches with full packs in the summer heat. Hand-to-hand combat drills that left men bruised and gasping. They learned to navigate by stars, to move silently through darkness, to assemble weapons blindfolded. And through it all, there was a philosophy taking shape, a quiet doctrine that would later unsettle German commanders who read the intelligence reports. American paratroopers were trained to operate independently. If scattered across miles of enemy territory, each man was expected to find the objective, link up with others, and complete the mission. No waiting for orders. No paralysis without a commanding officer present. Just initiative, aggression, and improvisation. The washout rate was high. Many men returned to regular infantry units, nursing injuries or simply unable to endure the psychological weight of it all. But those who remained, those who earned their silver wings, carried themselves differently. They walked with a certain bearing. Not arrogance, exactly, but certainty. By 1942, the first units were ready. The 82nd Airborne. The 101st Airborne. Screaming Eagles and All-Americans. They wore distinctive uniforms, high-jump boots polished to mirrors, baggy trousers bloused just so, patches on their shoulders declaring their status. They practiced in the dark. They practiced in wind. They practiced until the act of jumping became as natural as breathing. And then, quietly, they shipped overseas. To England first, where the hedgerows and stone walls reminded some of home. Where they waited in tent cities and drank warm beer in village pubs and wrote letters they hoped wouldn't be their last. The British soldiers watched them with curiosity. These Americans seemed so young, so confident. The British had learned caution through years of war. But the paratroopers, they had something else. Something the Germans would soon encounter. Outside, the English rain fell soft on canvas tents. Inside, men cleaned their rifles one more time, checked their reserve chutes, and tried not to think too hard about the missions ahead. Somewhere across the channel, German intelligence officers were beginning to compile reports. Photographs. Prisoner interrogations. Building a picture of what was coming. And in the quiet moments between training jumps, you could hear it, the low rumble of C-47 engines warming up, a sound that would soon become terribly familiar to soldiers on both sides. The night settles deeper now. The training grounds are empty and silent, waiting for morning. The Germans first met American paratroopers in North Africa, in November of 1942. When the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion dropped near Oran during Operation Torch. It did not go smoothly. The C-47s flew through darkness and scattered winds. Many men landed miles from their objectives, in Spanish Morocco rather than French Algeria. Some fell into the sea. Others crashed through trees or landed in rocky ravines. It was chaos, the kind of chaos that might have broken a less trained force. But something happened in that chaos. something the German advisors with the Vichy French forces noticed immediately. The scattered American paratroopers didn't surrender. They didn't wait for rescue. Instead, they formed small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, and began moving toward any military objective they could find. They attacked communication lines, ambushed supply columns, created the impression of a much larger force. A French officer, interrogated later, described them as phantoms aggressives, aggressive ghosts. They appeared from nowhere, struck hard, then vanished into the landscape. Young men, many barely 20 years old, operating with an independence that seemed almost reckless. But it was in Sicily, in July 1943, that the reputation truly crystallized. The drops were catastrophic from a planning perspective. High winds, friendly fire from nervous naval gunners who shot down their own transport planes. Paratroopers scattered across 40 miles of Sicilian countryside, landing in lemon groves and on volcanic rock, in village squares and enemy encampments. By all conventional military logic, the operation should have been a disaster. Yet the German defenders found themselves facing a nightmare. Small groups of Americans seemed to be everywhere at once. They cut telephone lines, destroyed bridges, ambushed motorcycle couriers, and spread confusion far beyond their actual numbers. A German major wrote in his diary about encountering 3 paratroopers who held a crossroads for 6 hours against superior forces, refusing to retreat even when clearly outnumbered. The German command began circulating warnings. Intelligence bulletins described American paratroopers as highly trained, aggressive, and dangerous even in small numbers. Officer candidates studied reports highlighting the American doctrine of initiative. Unlike Soviet paratroopers, who waited for direction, or British airborne troops, who generally operated in larger, more organized units, the Americans seemed almost anarchic in their flexibility. One particular incident became legendary in German officer circles. A Hauptmann, a captain, named Dietrich encountered a wounded American paratrooper near Jella. The young American, leg clearly broken from a bad landing, had still managed to booby-trap the approach to his position with German grenades he'd scavenged. When Dietrich's men triggered the trap, the paratrooper opened fire despite his injury. He was captured, eventually, but the captain reportedly told colleagues that the American never stopped trying to escape, even with a splinted leg. This wasn't superhuman courage. It was training. It was a culture built in those Georgia fields, in those night jumps, in the constant repetition of one simple message: never quit, never wait, never stop moving toward the objective. By the time Sicily fell, German intelligence files had grown thick with observations. Photographs of captured American equipment, the M1 Garand rifle, far superior to the Kar 98K. The paratrooper knife, designed for cutting shroud lines but equally effective in combat. The morphine syrettes sewn into uniform jackets. Everything spoke of preparation, of a military that had studied every detail. And underneath it all, something harder to quantify. A sense that these young Americans believed absolutely in their own ability to prevail. Not arrogance, belief. The Mediterranean sun set slow and golden over Sicily that summer. In farmhouses turned into command posts, German officers updated their maps and wondered what would come next. The answer was already forming, in the skies above England, where thousands of paratroopers prepared for something much larger. The files remained open on the desk, rustling slightly in the evening breeze. Spring came gently to Normandy in 1944. With apple blossoms in the ancient orchards and morning fog rolling off the channel like breath. The German defenders knew something was coming. They had known for months. The question wasn't if, but when and where. And Rommel, inspecting the Atlantic Wall, had ordered special attention paid to the possibility of airborne landings. He understood their potential. He feared it, quietly. Wooden poles, called Rommelspargel, Rommel's asparagus, sprouted in fields across Normandy. Thousands of them, planted at angles to impale gliders and break the legs of parachutists. In some meadows, the Germans flooded low-lying areas, turning pastoral fields into marshes. They strung cables between trees, lined ditches with barbed wire, and positioned machine gun nests to cover likely drop zones. But on the night of June 5, 1944, the fear became reality. The Pathfinders went first, small teams jumping in darkness, hours before the main assault, to mark drop zones with lights and radar beacons. Then came the great armada of C-47s, hundreds of them, droning through the night like a mechanical migration. Inside, young men sat in stick formation, weighted down with nearly 100 pounds of equipment each. Rifles, ammunition, grenades, rations, medical supplies, Bangalore torpedoes. Some carried radios. Some carried flamethrowers. All carried the knowledge that they were jumping into occupied France with no guaranteed support. The German defenders heard them coming. In coastal bunkers and village billets, in chateau command posts and hedgerow foxholes, soldiers looked up at the sky and felt something cold settle in their stomachs. The sound was immense, overwhelming, hundreds of engines creating a bass note that vibrated in the chest. Then the sky filled with silk. A German soldier named Heinz, stationed near St. Miraglise, later wrote to his sister about that night. He described watching the parachutes bloom against the moonlit clouds, beautiful, in a terrible way, like flowers or jellyfish drifting down. And then the realization, each one carried a man with a rifle. Each one represented a threat behind German lines. The 82nd and 101st Airborne landed scattered across miles of Norman hedgerow country. Many men found themselves completely alone, surrounded by enemy territory, with no idea where they were. The brass crickets they carried, children's toys really, became lifelines. Click-clack. Click-clack. Friend or foe determined by a simple sound in the darkness. What followed was a strange, fragmented battle. Not great sweeping movements of armies, but hundreds of small fights in the dark. A paratrooper named Jake Winters landed in a tree, hung suspended for 30 minutes cutting himself free, then walked 2 miles before finding another American. Together, they captured a German supply truck. With 3 men total, they held a bridge until reinforcements arrived at dawn. In their command post in St. Lo, German officers received confusing reports. Americans here. Sabotage there. Bridges blown. Roads blocked. Telephone lines cut. The carefully planned defensive response faltered because no one could determine where the main threat actually was. One lieutenant reported American paratroopers attacking from the east. 15 minutes later, a sergeant reported paratroopers to the west. Both were correct. Both were tiny groups operating independently. Both were creating chaos far beyond their numbers. A German regimental commander wrote in his after-action report, "The American Airborne demonstrated a level of individual initiative that made coordinated defense nearly impossible. Even when isolated and outnumbered, they continued aggressive action." The dawn came slowly to Normandy on June 6, 1944. The hedgerows dripped with dew. Smoke rose from a dozen small battles. And somewhere in every shadow, it seemed, an American paratrooper waited with a rifle and a determination that no amount of German training had quite prepared them for. The apple blossom still bloomed, untouched and perfect in the morning light. September brought autumn to Holland, and with it, one of the war's most ambitious gambles. Operation Market Garden. The plan was elegant on paper. Drop 3 airborne divisions to capture bridges across the Netherlands, opening a corridor for British armor to punch through into Germany itself. The American 82nd and 101st would take bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne would take the final prize, the bridge at Arnhem. For the German defenders, the prospect was deeply unsettling. Intelligence had warned them to expect scattered, chaotic American airborne operations. But this was different. This was daylight. This was massive. This was thousands of paratroopers and gliders arriving in broad afternoon sun on September 17, 1944. The drops themselves were remarkably accurate this time. The 101st landed near their objectives with precision. Men gathered quickly, oriented themselves, and began moving toward the bridges at Veghel and Eindhoven with mechanical efficiency. The months since Normandy had hardened them. They moved through the Dutch countryside with the confidence of veterans. At Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne faced one of the most formidable objectives, a massive steel bridge defended by German troops who knew its strategic importance. The German commander, a colonel named Heinke, had studied reports about American paratroopers. He ordered his men to be ready for anything. What he perhaps didn't anticipate was the sheer audacity of what came next. When ground assault failed to take the bridge quickly, American paratroopers attempted a daylight crossing of the Vaal River in flimsy canvas assault boats. German soldiers watching from defensive positions couldn't quite believe it. The Americans were paddling across 400 yards of open water, under machine gun and artillery fire, in broad daylight. It seemed like suicide. But they kept coming. Boats sank. Men died. But the survivors reached the far bank, stormed the German positions, and began fighting house to house toward the bridge. A German lieutenant, captured during the battle, asked his interrogator, "Don't your men know when to stop?" The American who interviewed him just shrugged. "They know. They just don't care." This attitude, this refusal to acknowledge defeat even when outnumbered, even when the objective seemed impossible, had become the defining characteristic that German officers feared most. It wasn't berserker rage. It was something colder. Professionalism mixed with an almost casual disregard for conventional military caution. Meanwhile, at Arnhem, the British paratroopers fought desperately against increasing German resistance. SS Panzer divisions happened to be refitting nearby, a piece of terrible luck. The British were surrounded, outnumbered, running low on supplies. And the American paratroopers holding the corridor behind them found themselves fighting a different kind of battle, not one quick strike, but sustained defensive combat, holding the road open against German counterattacks. For 9 days, the 101st defended what became known as Hell's Highway. German forces attacked from the flanks constantly, trying to cut the corridor and trap the British at Arnhem. The paratroopers, designed for quick raids and then withdrawal, instead had to function as conventional infantry. They held farmhouses, windmills, village crossroads. They fought off tanks with bazookas and determination. A German major named Becker, in his post-war memoir, wrote about attacking American paratroopers dug in around a Dutch farmhouse. "We outnumbered them 3-1. We had armor support. But they made us pay for every yard. When we finally overran the position, we found 6 Americans, nearly out of ammunition, still firing. One was wounded. He threw a grenade as we entered. That was their way." The operation ultimately failed in its larger goal. Arnhem was a bridge too far. But what German observers took from Market Garden wasn't that American paratroopers had been defeated. It was that even in a failed operation, even when things went wrong, they remained incredibly dangerous. The Dutch windmills turned slowly in the autumn wind, their shadows lengthening across fields where the fighting had passed. December 1944 brought snow to Belgium, thick and silent, muffling the world in white. The 101st Airborne was supposed to be resting. They'd been pulled from the line, sent to a quiet sector near the French border to recover from the brutal fighting in Holland. The town of Bastogne sat peaceful in the hills, a small crossroads market town where farmers sold cheese and children played in the square. Then, on December 16th, the Germans launched their final massive offensive through the Ardennes forest. Thousands of tanks. Elite divisions. A desperate gamble to split the Allied lines and reach Antwerp. And directly in their path, scrambling to respond, came the 101st Airborne, rushed north in trucks, many men still recovering from wounds, short on winter gear, lower on ammunition. They arrived in Bastogne on December 19th. By December 21st, they were surrounded. This was not what paratroopers were designed for. No jumping. No surprise. Just a defensive siege in brutal winter conditions against overwhelming German forces who wanted that crossroads badly. Several German divisions, including elite panzer units, pressed against the American perimeter from all sides. And here, in the frozen forests around Bastogne, the fear that German officers had developed reached its fullest expression. They knew the Americans were surrounded. They knew the paratroopers were outnumbered and low on supplies. They knew the weather had grounded Allied air support. All tactical logic suggested the Americans should surrender. On December 22nd, German officers approached under a white flag with a formal surrender demand. General McAuliffe's response became legendary. Nuts! The German officers were confused by the translation. Their American counterpart explained, "He means, go to hell." They returned to their lines shaking their heads. But what truly disturbed German commanders wasn't the defiant message. It was what happened next. The encircled paratroopers didn't just defend passively. They counterattacked. In the middle of a siege, outnumbered, surrounded, they launched aggressive patrols and raids against German positions. They captured supplies from their attackers. They fought for every tree-line and frozen field as if they were the ones doing the besieging. A German soldier named Kurt, captured on December 24th, told his interrogators he had never seen anything like it. His unit had attacked an American position near Foy expecting weakened, demoralized defenders. Instead, they encountered paratroopers who fought from ruined buildings and frozen foxholes with the same aggression they'd shown in Normandy. "They act like they're winning," Kurt said, bewildered. "Even when they're losing." The cold was extraordinary that week. Men's breath froze in the air. Wounds became potentially fatal from exposure. Medical supplies ran desperately low. Artillery shells in limited supply had to be carefully rationed. German forces had every advantage except one: the will of the men they surrounded. When Patton's Third Army broke through on December 26th, relieving the siege, they found not a defeated garrison clinging to survival but an organized, aggressive force that had been planning its own breakout. The paratroopers had never acted like they were trapped. They had acted like they were exactly where they wanted to be. In the years after the war, German officers who had fought in the Ardennes were interviewed extensively. Many spoke of Bastogne. One colonel put it simply: "We learned to fear American paratroopers not because they were better soldiers. Many of our men were equally skilled. We feared them because they seemed incapable of recognizing when they should be afraid. And that is a terrible thing to face in battle." The snow continued falling on Bastogne through Christmas night. In the forest, silence settled where violence had been. And somewhere in that quiet, between the frozen trees and starlit sky, the story of why German officers feared American paratroopers completed itself in the cold. The wind whispers now through those ancient woods. The past sleeps beneath the snow. And so, we've wandered together through training grounds and night drops, through chaos and courage, through the long winter siege where ordinary young men did extraordinary things. Let these images drift now, the silk parachutes blooming like flowers, the click-clack of brass crickets in the dark, the snow falling soft on Belgian woods. Sleep is waiting. History has been told. Rest well, dear listener. Tomorrow is far away, and tonight belongs to dreams.